Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. Before we get started, just a quick simple reminder that if you haven't already subscribed, please feel free to do so. I would greatly appreciate it. And also feel free to leave a comment and or suggestion about what you would like to see next. So I think for today's video, I'm going to go a bit more in depth into Apex REST web services. And more specifically, what I want to cover today is how we can use an Apex class to represent our JSON that is going to be coming in via the request, and also about how we can use the Apex class to send a response. Okay, so for today's scenario, I'm going to be using this supply object that we have in our Salesforce org. There's nothing special about it, but what I think I'm going to do is we're going to create an Apex REST web service that will have a post request that will allow anybody to basically send us some information about a supply, and then that REST web service will then create the supply record. Okay, so let's jump into it. Let's start with the supply JSON wrapper. And I've already gone ahead and created two classes. So as you can see here, there's a supply JSON wrapper, and we have our supply web service. It's pretty simple. If you don't already understand this, I have a video that will go into more detail. It's called Salesforce Apex REST Web Services Basics and Username Password Authentication Flow. So I'm basically just going to be piggybacking off of this video. Okay, so let's start with the JSON wrapper itself. For this class, there's going to be two main components to it. The first part will help us handle the post request itself. So basically accepting information about the supply record that we want to insert. And I will start off by creating a class within this class, and we're going to call this supply. Within this class, we're going to have some variables that will contain information about our supply record. So probably the most important one will be the name of the supply. And then let's also have one for the quantity, as well as one for the status, and one more for the unit cost. And in case it's not completely clear, these fields that we're providing right here are just the fields that exist in the supply object. And let me correct these spelling mistakes. Okay, so with that done, we've now created a JSON representation in an Apex class for our supply record. I also want to create another class. This will be called response. And this is the class we will use to send a response back to whatever called our web service. So this one will be pretty simple. We're just going to have a Boolean called success, as well as a string for message. And the message will just contain, information about whether the request was successful or it failed, or whatever it is. Okay, once we have that, let's go ahead and save it. And then we'll jump into our web service itself. So for the web service, you'll see here, I already went ahead and created the post request. It's just an empty scaffold. So let's go ahead and start filling it out. And to start, I am going to define the variables we had created in our response class. And I'm just going to give it a starting value of false. And then the string message will be empty, just to start with. Okay, so first thing we have to do is check the request context. So what I mean by that is we have access to this global variable called REST context, and that will contain the request we receive. And I'm basically just checking that it's not null, just to be a bit more defensive. So if we received a valid request, or a request that contains information, then we can start to kind of parse it out. So I want to get the request body from that request. And we will do it by using the rest context.request and then grabbing the request body and then just making that a string. From there, let's have another check. And here, I'm basically going to check to make sure that the request body is not empty, which we can do by calling the not_is_not_empty method on the string class. And then in here, we just will put the request body. So we're basically saying if our request body is not empty, then we can go ahead and finally begin to parse out that information. So here is where I will start to deserialize the request body that we got. And what I want to do is be able to accept, one supply or two supply or three supply. Basically, it doesn't matter whether the request that we receive is just one supply or many. But we need to be able to handle, one or more. So we're going to need a list. And inside of our list, we're going to have our supply JSON wrapper. And here we're going to use the supply class, the supply inner class that we had specified. And we'll close that out. And we'll just call this the supply payload. And that's going to be equal to what we deserialize. So JSON deserialize. And then we are going to deserialize the request body. And what we are going to use to deserialize it is the list, which is the supply JSON wrapper, the supply inner class, and we're calling the class. Okay, and I'm pretty sure we have to cast this here, and I'll explain what this means in just a second. So what this huge line means basically is we created a list that contains the supply inner class. So basically this right here. And basically all we're saying is we're going to expect a list of this type of class. And this part is just deserializing the request body. So we're deserializing the request body, and this is what we're expecting right here. So like I said, it's just a list of supplies. Once we have that, what I'm going to do is, or basically after we have that, then we can kind of go ahead and start to create our actual supply records. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a list of our actual supply records. And we'll call this supply records or supply record list. And I'm going to go ahead and create a method just to kind of keep our logic a bit clean and structured. So we'll call this method create supply records. And we are going to pass in that supply payload. And let's go ahead and create that method. So this method will be a private static, and it's going to return that list, the supply records. So let's go ahead and copy this right here because that is the type that we're expecting. And inside of here, what we're going to do is let's go ahead and create that list of supply records, sorry. And we'll call this supply record list. It's just, we're going to initialize it. And then we'll return it. Okay, and inside of here, we're going to have some logic to populate it. So let's go ahead and create a for loop. And then this for loop, all we're going to do is we're going to iterate through this supply payload that we have. So let's go ahead and copy that because I'm too lazy to write everything out. So basically, we're going to iterate through the supply payload. And I'll just give the name of the actual individual record. I'll give it a name of just supply. Okay, once that is done, inside of here, I'm going to go ahead and create an actual supply record. And we'll give that a name of supply record. And we'll just go ahead and initialize that. And here, once we have that, is where we can start to populate the supply record with the fields of our supply payload. Okay, and one thing I'm not going to do, but is kind of important, is we should probably add some type of validation for the fields before we go ahead and populate them. And what I mean by that, for example, is as an example, we have this status field, right, which is a pick list, and it's entirely possible that the service that called this endpoint and sent this request might have given us a bad value for status. And if we don't check that, this whole code will error out. I'm not going to check because this is just for demonstration purposes, but just something to be aware of. So let's go ahead and populate all the other fields as well. So we'll start with the name. And we'll set that to the supply name. We'll do quantity as well. And last but not least, we will do unit cost. Okay, so once all those fields are mapped, we have to then add this supply record into our supply list. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll do supply record list. Let's add that record in like that. Once we're done, let's format a little bit. And basically, just to recap everything we did, we created a method to just kind of contain all of that logic that maps the fields, the records we receive from the payload into an actual supply record. So as you can see here in our for loop, we're going to iterate through those through that JSON payload we received. And for each of those records in the JSON payload, we're creating a supply record that exists in Salesforce, and then we're just mapping those fields. Once we map those fields, then we add it to the supply record list that we defined up here. Once that for loop is done, we're just returning that completed supply list that contains the records. So once that's done, up here, let's add one more check just to kind of be safe. So we're going to say if that supply record list that was just populated up above actually contains at least one record, so if size is greater than 0, then we should be pretty safe to just insert the supply record list. And that's basically how we get our JSON payload into Salesforce. So, and then after that, let's go ahead and start working on the response payload that we're going to send back. So we'll say if that worked out, then we'll set that to true. And we'll make the message something like supply request processed successfully. Hope I spelled that correctly. Okay. In case that we weren't able to map fields or something else went wrong, let's have an else, and we'll say success is false, and let's give it a message. We'll say supply request not processed, verify that the required fields are provided, or contact the Salesforce admin for help. It's just something to give the user something to do in case there was a failure. And what I should probably do as well, right here, I should probably add a try catch. And the reason I'm doing this is because, something could go wrong when we're deserializing it. Maybe because the request itself had invalid JSON, or something went wrong right here as we're mapping it out. Maybe there was like an incorrect character, something that we didn't handle. So just because of that, I'm going to add a try catch. And we'll add it right there. And then let's add our catch. So we'll just have a broad exception. We're not going to go too crazy with it. Okay, let me format this a bit. Okay, so yeah, we're going to try to deserialize it. If something goes wrong right here, let's go ahead and again, we'll set our success to false and let's add a message. And this message, we can use the exception message itself. So let's say supply request, not processed. And then we'll say something like encountered error. And then let's just log that error out so that the user can know what to do right there. And then also additionally, what you could probably do if you have some type of like error log tracker in Salesforce, you could just, create one of those records yourself here. But we're not going to do that because I don't think we have any in this system. Okay, so with that done, we're done with the actual deserializing and insertion of our JSON payload. And it's now time to send or build the response that we will be sending back to the request itself. So right here, I'm going to go ahead and grab that response class that we had defined earlier right here. And the way we do so is by calling supply JSON wrapper, and then we're calling the response class, and we're going to create a new instance of that. Okay, and we should probably give it a name. And we'll call this response payload. Okay, so once we have an instance of a response class, we can then begin to populate it. And like I said, this is pretty simple. We only have those two fields. So we have the success. We're going to set it to the success variable that we had defined up above. And then as well as the message itself. Right there. Okay, and then lastly, we have to make sure to return that payload, that response back by doing a return. And that should take care of it. And it looks like we have some error messages, so let's see what we did wrong. It looks like I misspelled that. And I also misspelled this. And lastly, it's saying illegal conversion from supply JSON wrapper.response to string on line 39 right here. And that is because I forgot to basically convert this class into a string representation. And to fix this error, basically, I have to serialize this class itself into JSON. So basically what we can do is here, as we're returning it, let's instead return the serialized version of it. By doing that. And there we go. So again, one more time, when we do this, we're basically instantiating the response class. But what we have to do is we have to return basically a string representation of that class. So we can do that by using the serialize method, since this method returns a string. Okay, so once that is done, let's go ahead and go to our Postman right here. And like I said, I already have a video where I go over how to set up Postman and send requests and verify your user. I will not go into detail in this video. Feel free to refer to that video, which I'll leave in the description below. But anyways, first things first, we have to authenticate ourselves so that we can get an access token. And I'll go ahead and just do a send. And then we see here in the response, we have this access token, which I'll take and just copy. And then we have to then create our request to the web service. And as you can see here, this is my URL at the top. And this is the URL mapping right there, supply web service. So using those two pieces of information, we're able to create our URL. And all we have to do now is just define the payload itself. So as you can see here, I'm going to send a list of supplies. Let's go ahead and give it a different name. So we'll say, as a supply, we'll say something like wood, 1 quantity, and this will cost 100. And the next we'll do steel. We'll do 200 quantity, and that will cost 5,000. Okay. And just for fun, let's do a third one. And this one will be water. We'll do quantity of 20,000 and the cost is 5. Okay. So, and the fields themselves, they're kind of irrelevant. This is just to show that, this information will end up in our Salesforce org. Okay. So once we have 3 supplies in a list, let's go ahead and send it. And we see here, we got back our success message is true. And the message is supply request process successful. Now, if we go back to our Salesforce, back in our Salesforce org, if we go to the supply object and let's say refresh, we now see that we should have a few new records. But just to make it a bit more obvious, let's go ahead and create a new view. And we'll call these, I'll just call it inserted supplies or something like that. And let's go ahead and use the created date. Let's put the quantity, the status, the unit cost. Let's push this down. And to make it obvious, let's use a filter. We're going to do created date equals today. And this shows you all the records that were created today. As you can see here, the first 4, that was just me testing the code earlier. But as you can see here, the last 3 are the ones that we created ourselves. So you see here, steel, quantity of 200, unit cost 5,000, water 20,000, quantity, unit cost 5, wood, 1 quantity, unit cost 100. And if we compare that with our Postman, you can see it lines up with the values perfectly. So that's pretty much all it takes to use an Apex class to represent our JSON to both receive information and to send something back out. I think I'll stop there. I will probably create another video, a similar one, using this same concept of the Apex class to represent JSON, but we'll do it with a GET request. And yeah, I think this is a good place to stop it here. Feel free to let me know in the comments below if you have any questions, any suggestions, and thanks for watching.